Well, hello, welcome back. Thought I'd start this new unit by doing a little bit of a recap of the last one. The last one was called Chemical Reactions. And really a lot of this unit is about that, but we use a little different phrase. We call it a chemical change. But I just want you to know that chemical reaction and chemical change are just two names for the same thing. So I think what I'll do is I'll use a really common chemical reaction that you may have already learned about when you did a little life science, and if not yet, you will next year when you study biology, because one of the most important reactions in nature is called photosynthesis. It's how green plants are able to make and store energy in their cells. Okay? They use the carbon dioxide that's in the air all around them, and they through the course of the chemical reaction, form what's called glucose, and that is a plant's version of sugar. So it's not the same sugar that we eat, which is called sucrose, but it's plant sugar. So let me show you what's involved here, and in the course of doing this, we'll kind of recap some of the vocabulary that we used, and hopefully most of this is kind of a old hat for you and nothing new. So when we write the chemical equation, I'm going to write the products first. So carbon dioxide is CO2. I'll write its familiar name here. We don't spend a lot of time working on how to name these things, but I think that one you should recognize. And then we need some water. This is why we need to water plants. And H2O might be the most common formula that we see anywhere. Okay, and then we use an arrow. That arrow indicates that the change or the reaction is happening. And then we form what's called glucose. And here's the formula for glucose. It's probably the most complicated formula we've seen so far. It's C6H12O6. So it's made of 24 different atoms. And I'm not going to show you how they're all bonded together. 6 carbons, 12 hydrogens, and 6 oxygens all bonded together. And the other product is oxygen gas. Oxygen is one of these elements that we call diatomic. That means the oxygen atoms can't exist all by themselves. So when they're around other oxygen atoms, they always pair up and form a little bond with another oxygen atom, and we call it diatomic oxygen, or O2. Okay, it's just more stable that way. So this is our glucose, and this is our oxygen. Okay? So, just as a reminder, these are what we call the reactants: carbon dioxide and water. And the glucose and the oxygen are called the products. Notice, we have the same atoms making up our reactants and our products. It's carbon, it's oxygen, and it's hydrogen. Just 3 elements is all it takes for this very important fundamental reaction in nature. Okay? And it turns out that those 3 elements are the large part of all living things, including yourself. I mean, most of your stuff in your body is made of those 3 elements. All right? So all we do is we kind of swap positions here. Now, this does not fall into the category of one of the 5 types of reactions. That was one of the last lessons we did before we took our break. It's not a double replacement or single replacement. It's not a combustion. It looks a lot like a combustion one, but we are not starting with a hydrocarbon over here as one of our reactants. So it just doesn't fit into any of those categories. Now, this is not balanced, you might notice. Turns out it looks like it's going to be super complicated, but it's not the hardest thing to balance. I wouldn't necessarily expect you to do this, but I'll show you anyway. So right now, if we count our carbons, we have just 1 carbon in a carbon dioxide molecule, but we have 6 in a glucose, so that certainly isn't balanced. I'm going to do this in marker only because I know I'm not going to have to erase and go back and redo it, which is typically what we do when we try to balance equations. So I'm going to put a 6 here. Remember, that's a multiplier. This means I have 6 molecules of carbon dioxide for a total of 6 carbons and 12 oxygen atoms total. Okay? Now, if we look at our hydrogens, this water molecule just has 2, but over on the product side, the glucose molecule has 12. Well, that's not balanced. It's going to take 6 water molecules to provide all of the hydrogen that we need to make this 1 glucose molecule. Okay? And so our carbon and hydrogen is now balanced, but now we have to count our oxygens. And this is what makes this a little bit more complicated than most of the ones we've practiced, because we have oxygen in all four of our substances here. So as I mentioned before, with 6 carbon dioxide molecules, that's 12 carbons right there. And we have 6 water molecules, which is 6 more oxygens, because each water molecule has a single one. So we have 18 oxygen atoms on the reactant side right now. Well, how do we get 18 on the other side? Well, I don't want to change the number here for the glucose, because I just spent all this time figuring out how to balance my C's and H's. If I were to put a number here, it would multiply the C's and the H's, and I'd have to go back and redo it. But I do see that I have 6 oxygens accounted for already. Okay, remember I had 18 over here. I see 6 over here. So I've got to get 12 to get the remainder over here. How do I make this last oxygen into a total of 12 oxygen atoms? Well, it's 6 of those molecules. Remember, an oxygen molecule is 2 of them bonded together. So if I have 6 of those, that's 12 right here, and the other 6 there. So now we have 18 on both sides. So there is a balanced chemical equation for the formation of glucose through photosynthesis. A lot of times when you see this, you'll also see a couple of things written down. This only happens in the presence of sunlight, and we need a substance in the plant called chlorophyll. That's kind of where all of this happens. They are not part of the reaction, though. They're not a reactant. They're not a product. They're sort of what maybe stimulates it or allows it to happen, but I'm not going to include it in my equation. Okay, so we now have a balanced chemical equation. What we've seen is we have the same amount of carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen on both sides. If we were to do this on a balance and be able to measure how many grams we have, and we have the total number of grams on the reactant side will equal the total number of grams on the product side. Okay, that's the idea known as conservation of mass. All right, so there's a good recap of a lot of what we saw before about chemical reactions. All right, so for this second part of the notes here, I'm going to describe for you 4 common signs that a chemical change or a chemical reaction is happening. One of the goals for this unit is for you to be able to tell when a chemical change is happening versus what we're going to call a physical change. And I'll get into that more next time. But since we're pretty familiar with chemical reactions, I thought I'd start with those. So some of these we've seen before, and all of them are somewhat familiar to you. So I'm going to show you some things I actually had shown you earlier in the previous unit, and just point out how we see evidence that a chemical reaction is happening. Okay, let's look at some old footage. So do you remember that? It was one of the more dramatic chemical changes that I could come up with. And it had 2 of the very important signs that you can look for. And so I'm going to use that as an example for 2 of them. One is a color change. Okay, so we started with 2 clear solutions there. There was stuff in them, but it was dissolved so tiny that you couldn't see it, kind of like salt water. Can't see the salt in there, but when we mix them together, definitely saw a bright yellow color. So other examples of that might be like when you burn something, you know, it turns black. Like paper isn't black, but when you burn it, it is. Or toast isn't dark, but when you toast it, that's a chemical change that's happening there. It's not just a physical change when we toast bread. The other is a solid forms from 2 solutions. So those liquids that you saw me mix together, those are called solutions. They're just, solutions are when you take a solid and you dissolve it in something, typically water. Again, like salt water is a solution. You can't see the salt. You can just see the water because the salt particles are so tiny that they just don't show up to your eye. But when you mix them together and a chemical change happens, If you suddenly get a solid that can't dissolve, then that's a sign of a chemical change. You have a different substance after the reaction is done than what you started with, okay? That solid has a name, and it's precipitate. Kind of a big word. You've heard of precipitation, right? Whoops, almost started to write precipitation. Precipitate. The solid that forms from two solutions. So when one of your products is a solid, and you had started with just liquids before, that's when we say a precipitate has formed. Okay, so we saw that in that example as well. All right, let's look at another clip from that video, and we'll see another piece of evidence that a chemical change happens. Okay, so I'm preparing my next reaction. So I just put a little bit of baking soda in this cup right here, and I'll put it where you can see it under the camera. And I have a little vinegar. Now you've seen this one before. I did this one on the video. I decided to do it live because I've got some solid stuff here at home. So watch this. This is a pretty obvious reaction, I think. So what you see there, I swirl it around. What we saw there were those bubbles forming, right? Turns out that is carbon dioxide being given off from that. But that is the third sign that I want to point out that a chemical reaction is happening, and that is bubbles forming. Typically, gases aren't a common reactant, but they are a common product. And that's not always true. As I pointed out, like in photosynthesis, you have to have some carbon dioxide, and that's in the form of a gas. But when you have those bubbles that form in a liquid like that, that's a pretty sure sign that you got a chemical change happening. So I'll just write down this example here, baking soda and vinegar. Okay, and our final piece of evidence, and these are still just kind of rough. There's other signs as well, but these are the four common ones. A way that you'll know that you very likely could have a chemical change is if you have a temperature change. So if things get hot or cold, now that doesn't always occur. It turns out this reaction here that I just did, it actually makes it feel cold, okay? So that lowered the temperature. If I took the temperature of my vinegar and then took the temperature of my solution that I have here, it's actually a little bit lower in this one. I don't have something to take that temperature, but you can trust me on that. All right? Now, there are times where a temperature could change and we don't have a chemical change, but I'm going to give you some other ways to be able to tell the difference between something that's a chemical reaction versus something that we call just a physical change, where the substance doesn't change it what it is, it just maybe change its form or something like that. Okay, but this is as far as I want to go here. So let's make sure we got all four of these down. Go back and replay anything you need to, and then you'll want to use these when you go about doing your worksheet. Okay.